The place is London. The time, a cold January morning in 1803. George Foster sits in his cell at Newgate Prison, awaiting execution. But the Murder Act of 1752 means that his death will not be the end of his punishment. George's corpse will be handed over to Giovanni Aldini for medical experiments. Aldini, a visiting professor from Italy, had promised the authorities that, with the right conditions, and of course the right corpse, he would be able to bring it back to life. A crowd gathered, the batteries hummed, mum, mum, mum. Electrodes were applied to the body of George Foster. The crowd gasped as his jaw quivered, a fist clenched, and an eyelid opened. George had been reanimated? But no. Minutes soon turned into hours, and the battery, like George Foster, was dead. A young physician, Anthony Carlyle, had watched this gruesome experiment. Later, he visited the home of William Godwin. Godwin's house on a Sunday evening was where writers and scientists, philosophers gathered to talk about morality, society, and of course the emerging technology of electricity. Among the children sent upstairs that evening was Mary Godwin. Many years later, she immortalised Aldini. Armed with a body, electricity, and a sense of purpose that matched his, Mary's character would continue in fiction what Aldini had started in real life. His name was, of course, Victor Frankenstein. Hello everybody, my name is Jamie Dobson and welcome to this episode of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. I sing the body electric. Well, that was the unbelievable true story of how Giovanni Aldini tried to bring a body back to life right here in London, in Newgate Prison, which was built into the ancient Roman walls of the city. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, I think you may have guessed it by now. We're going to be talking about the battery. Now, the story of the battery gives us a central theme to our work and, of course, to this podcast. Technologies are invented and they are often solutions looking for a problem. So like the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard once said, life has to be lived forward but can only be understood backward. That's exactly the same for technologies. Us humans tend to invent things before we figure out exactly what to do with them. So where on earth did this all start? Well, of course, it started back in Italy with Aldini's uncle, Luigi Galvani. Aldini's uncle was Luigi Galvani. Galvani was interested in electricity and, very importantly, its relationship to biological tissues. For example, he wanted to know how on earth, and maybe we also want to know, how on earth does the electric eel produce electricity? One of his experiments involved a frog's leg. It was completely severed from the body, of course, not Galvani's body, from the frog's body. When the leg was placed in a circuit with two different types of metals, boom, the leg twitched. Galvani called this animal electricity. Now, Galvani had a best friend. His name was Alessandro Volta, and Volta begged to differ. He said the frog's leg has got absolutely nothing to do with the circuit, but instead the electricity is coming from the two different types of metal. The twitch, according to Volta, was caused by the circuit that had formed between the two metals. Now, Volta was actually onto something, and actually he went on to prove this by placing two different types of metal on his tongue. When he did that, of course, his tongue tingled. Now, the next question from me to you is, have you done this? When you were a kid, did you have one of those old-fashioned batteries with the two clips on, and did you ever stick it on your tongue? Well, I certainly did do that as a child. The sensation I felt would have been very similar to what Volta had felt all those years ago. Now, of course, my advice to you is you should go and buy one of those batteries and test it out today. Well, Volta was more than just a kid messing around. He was, of course, an extremely serious scientist. And when his tongue had tingled that day, he started to come to a conclusion, a different conclusion. Maybe, he thought, electricity has got something to do with the senses too. Now, he went on to prove that by doing the following. Now, close your eyes and try to visualize this if you can. Volta created a circuit that included his own eye, his tongue, and a frog's leg. When he closed the circuit, the leg twitched, his tongue tingled, and a flash of light appeared in his eye. So he was definitely onto something. He had proven that electricity had something to do with the senses. He now needed to prove that the frog's leg had nothing to do with the circuit. He needed, in other words, to win that argument. This is what he did. He took a number of small circles made out of silver and zinc. He stacked them in a pile, and in between the metal discs, he placed brine-soaked cloth. Now, brine is just salt water, highly concentrated salt water. He then connected the top and the bottom of the discs together to form a complete circuit, and of course, voila, or eureka if you prefer, electricity flowed. And of course, only this time it did so without any frog's legs whatsoever being involved. Now, this is actually where the story gets very interesting. It looked like an extremely elegant physics experiment at first glance, and it seemed that Volta was right. But like Galvani, he was also partially wrong. Where was the electricity coming from? It wasn't in the metals, that wasn't true. And it also wasn't in the frog's legs either. No, this was nothing to do with physics or biology. This was chemistry. There was a chemical reaction occurring between the two metals. This chemical reaction, it corroded one of the metals, and in the process it released an electron. Now, Volta did not quite know what he'd discovered, but nevertheless, as a mark of a respect to his former friend, by this point they of course had fallen out big time, Volta called this process galvanism. Galvanic corrosion, however, is of course what happened to the metal and their friendship. Because this whole argument had started with electric eels and how they generate electricity, Volta went on to describe the device as an artificial electric organ. However, the discs were piled on top of each other, so all the other scientists of the day started to call this thing, this contraption, a voltaic pile. Then somebody noticed that these piles, or the cells in this strange organ, when they were stacked together, looked an awful lot like a battery of cannons. The argument between Volta and Galvani has to go down as one of the stupidest in the history of science. Why? Well, it's actually very simple when you think about it. The brine-soaked felt in Volta's circuits had played the exact same role as the wet frog's leg had done in Galvani's. They had invented the same thing. The frog's leg had nothing to do with it at all. All that mattered is that there was something damp, an electrolyte is what these things are officially called, that could help facilitate the chemical reaction between the two different metals. So the irony here is that Volta's battery produced a galvanic current, and Galvani's circuit, with its frog's legs, was a single-cell voltaic pile. You literally could not make this stuff up. And in a way, it was really sad, because a split occurred. At the very moment these two gentlemen were experimenting, the world of electricity and the world of neurology were the same thing. And I think the world would be a better place if we studied them as the same thing. But all of a sudden, these two fields of inquiry started to divorce. The world of electricity moved forward as the battery, which went into the telegraph, which itself would move forward and change into the telephone. In the meanwhile, neurology, the study of bodies and electricity within humans would continue with the insane research of Aldini and his work on that corpse of George Foster. So that was the moment when neurology and electronics were divorced. They would be reunited in the following century when Frank Rosenblatt invented the perceptron, or what we call artificial neural networks. But back then, in the time of Shelley, that was all well and truly in the future. And between that date and the day of Frog's Legs, time, of course, moved forward. Aldini grew old, and of course, Mary Godwin became Mary Shelley. And later she wrote, "By the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature." Sound familiar? Yeah, it sounds a little bit like what happened to George Foster, doesn't it? So all of a sudden, with the arrival of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, electricity and neurology enter into mythology with one of the greatest works of science fiction ever written. And so Shelley had created a classic example of the creature taking over the creator and, of course, eventually destroying them. We've seen this in many places. The Jewish folk story of the Golem is one of them. More recently, we see James Cameron's Terminator. The idea of autonomous killer robots or killer creatures speaks to something deep inside of us, and it seems to be irresistible to scientists, journalists, and people just like us. In between the modern Prometheus and the Terminator, there is, of course, the storyline of the 1966 series of Doctor Who. The War Machines contains a character, a computer called Wotan, Will Operating Thought Analog. Wotan is installed at the post office, and soon after it connects over the telephone network to computers just like it. In other words, that 1966 series of Doctor Who foreshadowed the arrival of the internet by at least a couple of decades. Now, Wotan and the network of computers that it's connected to becomes self-aware, and it comes to the stunning conclusion: the only way to control the degenerates of the swinging 1960s with their miniskirts and their mainframes was to deploy an army of robotic war machines. The computer taking over, which is really not much different to the creation taking over that we saw in Shelley's Frankenstein, is a common trope within science fiction. And this is, I think, why. It plays to our deepest fears that the Enlightenment values of autonomy and choice will be taken away from us. But of course, on second glance, these are not really Enlightenment values, are they? No, it's something different. They are deep values that sit within us as humans. So this is why I think journalists, science fiction writers, and all of us listening to this podcast find these tales of us losing our autonomy and being enslaved by robots absolutely irresistible. Unfortunately, the problem with the robot taking over right now is not particularly helpful. This is a theme we'll return to as this podcast unfolds. So let's get back to our main story. By the time the story of Victor Frankenstein had captured the imagination, Cook and Wheatstone in England and Samuel Morse in the United States had found a practical problem for the battery. It was, of course, the telegraph. The telegraph used simple dots and dashes, combinations of which mapped to a special alphabet. This is a crucial moment in the history of computing. The letters were dots and dashes, and they were coded on one end of the telegraph line, only to be decoded by an operator on the other end. What this means is that the telegraph was a system of information based on binary and digital signals. Well, of course, Thomas Edison had not yet invented the grid. And so the battery was used to power the telegraph lines. Now, luckily for us, the telegraph had low power needs. Therefore, we have reached an extremely important point in the history of the computer. The telegraph used binary and digital signals. It foreshadowed the computer machines of the following century, and it wouldn't have been possible unless Galvani and Volta had argued about those frogs' legs. The arrival of the telegraph, which soon went viral, immortalised Volta. Well, it immortalised the battery. It found a practical use for it. And of course, Volta lives on again in electrical engineering as the symbol V, which is short for volts. Volts, by the way, are the unit of measurement of electrical potential that's named after him. You need to look that up on the internet because honestly, as a computer programmer, this type of stuff scares me. And of course, Aldini lived on forever, immortalised as Victor Frankenstein. What happened to Galvani? Galvani deserves credit, more credit than he probably gets. And he deserves credit very simply for discovering a source of electricity within the nerves and muscles. This is, of course, responsible for our nervous system and the neural networks of our minds and for muscle contraction. In fact, without electricity, organic bodies simply do not function. There is another experiment from Galvani, a crucial experiment, less famous than the one involving the frog's legs and the two metals. Now, in this experiment, Galvani was able to show that a muscle would twitch when he cut the end of the sciatic nerve in two legs and connected them together. Now, this is a gruesome experiment to visualize. However, when he touched those two sciatic nerves together, the frog's legs twitched without any metals being involved whatsoever. So there was something inside the muscle that caused the twitch. He was right all along, but the original experiment just didn't show it. So what we're left with is the following. Volta demonstrated that muscle contractions in the original experiment were most likely, well actually not most likely, they were certainly caused by the electricity that was released by the chemical reaction between the two metals. In that experiment, the frog's legs took the role of the brine-soaked felt. The frog's legs were, in other words, an electrolyte. This means that between them, they didn't see the whole picture, but they almost had the whole picture together. Electricity flowed both within organic bodies, where it was used to help us function, and, this is important, and it is generated within those bodies. Of course it's generated within the bodies. How on earth does the electrical eel work? This was the biological mystery that they were solving at the time. However, they also both discovered, even though neither of them knew it, that two metals, when connected by an electrolyte, such as the soaked felt or the frog's legs or whatever, facilitated a chemical reaction. And that chemical reaction released an electron. That was what they discovered, and that is the key underlying property of the battery. In many ways then, electricity with its digital signals, and especially after Thomas Edison captured Zeus's thunderbolts and managed to trap them in his grid of restless energy, pushed neurology into the background. Each new invention seemed to power the next wave of change, with information machines that emerged from the telegraph becoming smaller and smaller, and as they did get smaller, they dangled in front of humanity the tantalizing idea that these information machines maybe, just maybe, could think. But alas, they could not think. Luckily for us, in the background in the last century, scientists, neurologists were chipping away at how the brain works. Now, Charles Sherrington famously in 1940 said the following about what happens when a person wakes up, what happens, that is, to the brain. It is as if the Milky Way entered upon some cosmic dance. Swiftly, the headmass becomes an enchanted loom where millions of flashing shuttles weave a dissolving pattern. Always a meaningful pattern, though never an abiding one. A shifting harmony of sub-patterns. This was the brain, the amazing thing that's almost impossible for us to understand. Then something remarkable happened. Frank Rosenblatt published a paper on a special kind of algorithm called the perceptron. Inspired by the brain's architecture, Rosenblatt realized machines will never be able to compute like the brain does unless they are designed in a similar way. Now, engineers eventually implemented the perceptron as a computer program, so we got not just artificial neural networks, but simulated artificial neural networks. This work was slow-moving, not least because a ruthless hatchet job, no more destructive than the previous battle between Galvani and Volta, kicked research into the perceptron into the academic long grass. But nevertheless, inside Rosenblatt's perceptron, neurology and electricity had finally been brought back together. The historical rift had been healed. Of course, electricity and neurology, they live together in Rosenblatt's perceptron, which itself lives on in the artificial intelligence systems that we use today. We are now at the end of our episode. We have seen the battery emerge as a technology that was at first a solution looking for a problem. The battery itself had emerged from a conflict between Volta and Galvani, and as so often in the history of technology, it came because somebody was trying to scratch an intellectual itch. Now, this is, of course, a polite way of saying somebody was trying to win an argument. There is a powerful lesson here for those wanting to succeed with cloud computers or, of course, generative AI technologies. Companies build something first. They must spend time, energy, love and money on building things that only later they may find a use for. Remember the words of Kierkegaard: life must be lived forward but understood backward. That is the real lesson of the battery, and that is the real lesson for managers and leaders who are figuring out what it is they need to do next. Now, I don't believe in heaven, and I'm not sure you do, but if there is one, maybe heaven looks a little bit like a lake in Switzerland. On the side of the lake is a cottage. Inside sit Aldini, his uncle Galvani, Volta and Mary Shelley. They must be looking down on what mankind did with electricity and neurology with amazement. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Visionaries, Rebels and Machines on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people to discover the show, and of course, we'd like a few more listeners. To find out more about me, the work I do, or to buy a copy of the book, please visit the website. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.